Welcome to Tramlines, a podcast from Agrii. I'm your host, Tony Smith, putting your questions to the experts. In this episode, I'm talking about varieties and oilseed rape with Agrii's Seed Technical Manager, John Miles. We will be looking at varietal choice and oilseed rape, considering varietal traits and why the decisions we make choosing a seed variety are so important. So, John, good morning to you.
Good morning, Tony.
Well, it's a Monday morning, John, so I hope you had a great weekend. As a starting point, it would be great to find out a little bit more about you and your experience. I know you've got quite a pedigree working in seed breeding and the seed industry in general, so tell us all a bit about that.
Okay. Man and boy, I think is the phrase. After leaving college in the dark days of 2002, wanting to be an agronomist, ended up at CPB Twyford. And so have worked on the breeding side and the trial side. And I think with everybody who's in plant breeding, they generally stumble into it. And then because they get so enthralled, they don't generally leave. And that was really the case of why I've been there for the last 19 odd years, was just found it immensely interesting. And for the last 10 years, I've been the commercial agronomist, the product development manager at what is now KWS, with my role looking at what's coming through, getting the agronomy messages right. Ultimately, you just want farmers to have the best experience possible with those genetics, get them to work right and be as profitable as possible. So anything you can learn, any do's or don'ts, particularly the don'ts, are worth communicating. So I just want people to get on well with this stuff and grow it to the best of their ability.
And that, of course, is the end game, isn't it? Is what I'm hearing there is you want growers to have great results growing the crops that they put in the ground. So can you remind us of some of the principles that agronomists and growers should be considering when it comes to actually choosing varieties?
Well, I think one of the key things, the conversations have been for a number of years now, is there's a lot of products. How do you choose the right one? It's all a bit confusing. The list has gone to 3 pages. It's kind of it can get a bit bamboozled by it all. And for me, I've always wanted to be very simple about it. What do you want? What is it you're trying to achieve? How has it got to fit on your farm? Because after many years of talking to a number of farmers, there's no one farm business that looks similar to another one. So I've always thought of it as a shopping list. When you go to the summer days and things, have a shopping list of what is it you want from a variety, from a crop type, to tick the boxes on your farm. And of course, that's changing at the moment with, we're going to be, we've got the first year of reductions in BPS. That's starting to really focus minds, has done for a few years, but, the pressure's really on now. So I think it's what do you want and how is it going to fit? Now, growers might, obviously yield and profitable yield is the key driver. There still needs to be some decent level of output at the end. But some of these sort of softer benefits around the outside are key to variety choice. It's got to be easy to manage. That's one of the key things where, you get on a farm situation, and particularly these days when there's blocks of land that are a long way away, they actually create some management headaches. And I think, varieties can have a big impact on easing those headaches, really. There's other things, obviously, a lot of people have moved from a plough-based system to a min-till system and are now moving to a direct drill system. And that creates challenges in different soil types in different regions of the country, different weather patterns. But actually crop type and varieties within those crops can really help. So again, just a couple of examples of going, right, what do you want? What is your ideal when it comes to the solution for that sort of predicament or that challenge that you've got on farm? So yeah, that's kind of my long-winded principle, really.
And so from a point of view of that shopping list that you mentioned, what else should be on that list?
There's all the traditional elements in terms of what sort of markets you're going to grow for. Some species like oilseed rape or or barley don't really have too many markets, whereas wheat can be quite regionalized in what market opportunities there are. So there are all the traditional ones about that. Sowing date is another key one. Some areas of the country have gone quite far back into October, and other areas of the country, because of the weather conditions, are stuck on the earlier end, looking at mid-September drilling. So there's all the traditional sort of challenges with choosing varieties that also sit in there from there. But I mean, I think we've got challenges with oilseed rape and flea beetle, and that's seen a reduction in the area. We're all looking for the next crop. I think everybody recognizes we need a more diverse rotation, but it's how does that fit? Can you grow that species successfully? Can you have a local market? Because haulage and availability of truck drivers, and then there's lots of things that it sort of add, that sort of filter in, to your decision point or where you end up.
Yeah, and I think what you've just highlighted there, John, is just the range of factors that growers and agronomists have to consider before deciding which crop and indeed which variety to put in the ground. Just coming back to your comment about some of the specific challenges for oilseed rape, what are some of the varietal traits that we can look out for and consider?
Yeah, I think oilseed rape has really come under pressure in the last couple of years. The cabbage stem flea beetle and the lack of seed treatments has shown us how critical it is that everything goes right in the establishment phase. I have a phrase that I like to use called wriggle room, and that's where varieties can really help in terms of maximizing wriggle room, because we don't live in a perfect world. There's always stuff going to go wrong. And actually, if you've got a good solution, then you've maximized some wriggle room in there. And with oilseed rape, I think we know that we need the weather on our side. We need to get that crop established and up and away. And if we do get it established well, it needs to stand and lots of things. But this sort of vigor from a variety point of view is probably one of the key things. We have seen slower types, and this is where it's quite interesting that on the continent, because of the colder winters and things that they have, the variety type that is suitable is very different. If you're having standard days are -12 and you haven't got any wind cover, any snow cover from the wind, these varieties tend to hug the ground. They're quite short, and they go outwards rather than upwards. Whereas I've always joked, the English or the British oilseed rape, we tend to, if you can't lose a Labrador in it by the time you get shooting, it's not maybe big enough. It's definitely got to hide a spaniel. So we want a very, very different type. And so, of course, if you want vigor with, it's a balancing act. You want vigor on one hand, but if it is massive, you don't want it falling over on the other. And I think that's probably the key driver on the variety front. I think what we've seen in the last few seasons with when the cabbage stem flea beetles really got bad is all of those little things that you can do on farm have a really big impact.
Yeah, and we can see this spring, can't we? In terms of the weather being just so variable, going from that really cold and dry, protracted period, and now all of a sudden we've got a forecast showing just endless rain and still quite cold temperatures. And just thinking about oilseed rape, and you were talking about that varietal choice and giving a little bit of wriggle room, is that going to be even more relevant and important as we see more unpredictable weather patterns? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's, with unpredictable weather patterns, they do seem to happen in blocks, and they seem to be more extreme. So I guess if the, traits take a long time to develop, and sometimes, that they have to be either rewarded in the market, particularly if they're an end user trait, but they have to be sort of commercially acceptable. And generally what happens as traits come to market is that, because they come from a breeding background, they're not, at the same yield level as perhaps some of the varieties in the market at that time. So it takes a good amount of work to bring them in with a sensible yield level. And I guess with things like pod shatter and turnip yellows, in oilseed rape, they are in the market at some of the top yield levels. And those two examples, I mean, as you said, if we're starting to drill earlier, or really just trying to get crops established, what if we end up with an issue with aphids, and our insecticidal options are nearly non-existent, then turnip yellows would come into its own. If the weather's warm and the aphid numbers explode, that comes into their own. Pod shatter, I guess we probably haven't had severe storms around combining time in many places recently. But of course, all that oilseed rape that you've worried about and lost sleepless nights over, to actually all end up on the floor for a weather event at harvest, so there are these traits out there, and I think they are insurance policies in a way, in terms of, just covering these eventualities, because it does seem that the season, the weather is not as benign as perhaps it once was. So I think they will sort of come in.
Right. And just, with regards to varietal traits in oilseed rape, I mean, there are quite a few that are available within those selection of varieties, aren't there? You mentioned about the turnip yellows, canker, pod shatter. What others could we be considering?
I think for me, verticillium tolerance has been something that's been quite key, because of the way that rotations traditionally have been quite tight, and obviously we're pushing them out. Verticillium is soil-borne and does exist for a good long time in the soil. So tolerance to that, and of course, verticillium in a normal year where there's no stresses, you might not see any impacts. But what we have seen in the dry springs is verticillium really take a burden on the plant, and that's really knocked things. So that's one of my personal favorites is verticillium. There are others which sort of seem to be more seasonal. I mean, when it comes to wheat, soil-borne mosaic virus is talked about a bit this time of year. People go, what is this in my crops? And there's not many lines with soil-borne mosaic virus. But if you've got soil-borne mosaic virus, it's one of the most important traits for you. So it's kind of one of those, it's a resistance gene that's been around before, but commercially it never really sort of it never really sort of comes to fruition as something that's really, really important. But as I say, if you've got it, then it's very important.
Yeah, of course. And that reminds me of a conversation we had before today, John, where we were talking about the benefit, the balance between what that seed breeding can offer and what's presenting, I guess, on the farm. So it's always going to be a balance, isn't it, John?
Yeah, and I think from a plant breeding point of view, some of these traits, particularly some of the new stuff, like the BYDV tolerance and resistance we have in barleys and wheat, these things have taken 20, 30 years of development. So there is a price tag that comes with that. I guess it's how then do you sort of get it into the market, and sort of try and cover some of those costs, but also don't have it as a barrier to entry into the market, and it's still valuable for the farmer. And I think the BYDV stuff is probably the most topical one at the moment.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, I'm based in the southwest of England, and having seen many a field where we see the effects of BYDV emerge in the spring, it's awful, isn't it? Because it's too late. There's nothing that can be done. And of course, even within the southwest of England, there's going to be areas of a farm that are more prone to that problem than others. And so some of those developments bring huge benefits, don't they? And I'm assuming also if actually the available chemistry is limiting as well.
Yeah, and I think the motivation for, broad spectrum insecticides, at the back end of autumn or indeed in the spring, like with blossom midge resistance in wheat, I've never met a farmer who didn't want to stop spraying insecticides in early June, and kill all the beneficials. And the same thing with the BYDV. So I think there's a move to sort of reducing the use of insecticides, and these traits will definitely help that. I mean, in barley, something I've obviously worked quite a lot on in KWS was the YD2 tolerance trait. Now, the big thing for me was, how do we use this on farm? What does it mean? The so what to the farmer? And as you say, just touching on the cost of the stuff, does it present value to the farmer? That's probably been one of my key things over the last couple of years. And tolerance is different to resistance. Tolerance is that the BYDV virus can be circulating within the plant, so it is there as a within the plant tissue, so other aphids that do come in and feed could then pick up the virus and leave with it. So it's sort of it's not the complete, what you design as the complete option, but it is part of a solution. But interestingly, the work I've done before with quite high levels of aphid is that you have complete yield security. So you don't have to then spray insecticide to protect your yield. You could then look at the beneficials coming in to leave those. And as you say, where do you use it? One of the personal favorites was to be using BYDV tolerant barleys in those high risk areas, whether it be the southwest or for the rest of the country, whether it be, on the headlands or next to watercourses where we've got pyrethroid buffer zones, whether it be around schools, or villages, all of those areas where you could lose significant yield if you let BYDV go completely uncontrolled, but also at the same time you don't really want to be spraying insecticides there. So that's where one of the reasons one of the big uses I see for the BYDV tolerant and resistant material is in those high risk areas. It may well be that the trade-off, or they might be worth it to do the whole field, and particularly when you're talking about some of the things like the wheats and the barleys, particularly with the southwest, where you have to drill your normal time. Once as you go further west, once you get into October, it becomes too wet to really get on, but you are in quite a high risk BYDV area, so you're kind of dictated to what your successful drilling date is. So if that's where the sticking point is, then using a tolerant or resistant wheat can enable you to achieve your early drilling, but then you don't have to go and apply loads of insecticides.
So it will soon be June. It will soon be that time to start thinking about varieties, particularly obviously oilseed rape first. What are your top tips for growers and of course agronomists as well in terms of what we should really be focusing on when it comes to that important time for choosing varieties? What are your views, John?
Yeah, okay. I think when I thought about this, I think we've had some very, very tricky autumns, but we hopefully should have learnt what some of our biggest pinch points are. Now, I think when we sat here last June, then we would have gone, we can't have another autumn like that one, can we? That was awful. And then we did. So I wouldn't, we could have a very dry autumn, or we could have another challenging one, another block of weather comes in. So I think for me, sort of top tip for considering varieties is, again, going back to what do you want? Because, have we got to think about our scenario of another wet autumn?
And to help with those important decisions, could you remind us of the main go-to places for that varietal information, John?
I think you've got the good old recommended list. I think field days, the recommended list is an umbrella for the whole country. The field days and your local information is where you really dial in. Agrii, we've obviously got the Agrii advisory list, which your agronomists have access to, and that's kind of putting our information in with it to supplement the RL, fills in the gaps, things like verticillium and autumn and spring vigor, particularly for oilseed rape. And the new way of thinking about varieties, which was launched the other year, is the variety sustainability rating.
Thank you, John, for your time today and also for your expertise and giving us something to think about when it comes to varietal selection and oilseed rape. And interestingly, some of the varietal traits that we should be looking out for that could be helpful on farm. Choosing the right crop and variety is, after all, a huge decision growers have to make in the farming calendar. That's it for this podcast, but do tune in again as we meet the experts throughout the season, exploring the many immediate and longer-term questions for growers and farmers in the UK. If you have any questions that you would like us to ask the experts, email info@agrii.co.uk. See you next time.